Welcome to Professor Ortlieb's Blue Book Podcast, a series of podcasts designed to teach 1L students the basics of legal citation using the Blue Book. In this episode, we're going to explore how to cite statutes according to Blue Book Rule 12 and Blue Pages Rule B12. When looking at citing statutes, we have to remember that we have two different statutory schemes. The first scheme we're going to talk about today are how to cite federal statutes. There are 5 components to a federal statute cite. First is the official name of the act, if it's commonly cited that way or if helpful. 2 is the title number. 3, the code abbreviation. 4, the section symbols and numbers. 5, the year of the code. Here it is an example of how the Indian Child Welfare Act might be cited in full. The Indian Child Welfare Act is a common federal statute that's known by its name, rather than just by scattered provision codes. Therefore, I would start off by typing in its common name, the Indian Child Welfare Act. I'd follow that by a comma, followed by the title number, which is 25, USC, which stands for United States Code, and then double section 1901 to 1963. This indicates that this is the entire span of the statute within the U.S. Code. I use 2 section symbols because I'm going to use 2 section symbols anytime I have more than one section of a statute, not subsection, but large section. Finally, I close with 2012 as my year of publication. So let's break down this a little bit further. How would you compose your cite? On the right of the screen, you see the U.S. Code as it appears on the federal government's U.S. Code website, sponsored by the House of Representatives. Now, back in the day, you might have looked at your code in print, in the United States Code, because that's the official code. But more likely than not, now, you're more likely to be looking at your statute online. So let's talk about how you find the information to compose your cite using the official code as printed on the House website. First of all, I need to find my title. The title here is Title 4. I can find it by looking up at the top box. It's generally the number printed before USC. Next piece I need is the code abbreviation, which is USC. You can see it here. Now note the difference between what you see in the screen from the House website. USC is closed up with no periods, but the Blue Book abbreviation that we need to use is U.S.C. Next is my section number. I can see it at the top by my 4 USC, but I can also see it here at the red arrow, Section 8. So I'm going to put that in there. The question that we have left is how to do the year. Well, you should know that the United States Code, the official U.S. Code, cited to USC, is published every 6 years. The most recent one is 2012. So as long as you're citing a current piece of the United States Code that is active now, you could cite to the year 2012. But let's talk about how you would find the year if you didn't know that the United States Code was published every 6 years, or how to find the year on any other code book. First place we look to find the year for a Blue Book cite is on the spine of the book. If it's not on the spine, check the title page. If it's not on the title page, check the copyright page. And if it wasn't in the main volume, check the pocket part or supplement for that date. Putting the cite all together from the sample that we looked at in the previous slide, you get something like this. 4 space USC, all capitals with periods. There's a section symbol. Note that there is a space before and after that section symbol, as we learned in our Blue Book format rules a few podcasts ago. Section 8 is there. I have a space, and then I put my year of publication, 2012, close my parens, and end with a period. This is the cite that you're going to use most often in your writing. You may occasionally need to use the full name of an act, but only generally where that act is well known. So what about the unofficial codes? Well, just as we saw with case reporters, the Blue Book has its list of preferred codes to use in every jurisdiction, including the federal jurisdiction. So the U.S. code is the preferred code to cite by the Blue Book. We know it because it's listed first in Table T1. So the other codes are not preferred by Blue Book, but in reality, they're the ones that you're more likely to find and use, and that's both in print and online. You can see two examples right here. The United States Code Annotated in the upper picture, and the United States Code Service in the bottom picture. Both of these codes are annotated codes, meaning they contain not only the actual law, but helpful research citations and annotations of other cases interpreting each provision of the United States Code, making your research a lot easier. Because these prints of the codes are much more useful for your research, these are the ones that a library is more likely to stock. So, how do you do this? Well, first of all, figure out which unofficial code you're using. And remember, Westlaw carries the United States Code Annotated. Lexis carries the United States Code Service. So when you're using those electronic forms, you are, in a sense, looking in these books, albeit electronically. Use the appropriate abbreviation. The United States Code Annotated is abbreviated USCA. The United States Code Service is printed USCS. In addition to the date and the parenthetical, you're going to have to include the publisher. Don't worry, it's not something you need to memorize. If a publisher is needed within your citation for a code, the information that you need to put in that cite will be found in T1. Here's an example of how you might cite to the same statute we looked at before in the unofficial code. Note that I just added the A to my USC, and I added my publisher, which is West. Now sometimes the material that you're looking for or you're looking at, the current law, doesn't appear in the main volume, but instead appears in a pocket part or supplemental volume to the printed code. When your information, your piece of code that you want to cite to, comes from one of those supplements, either that pocket part or the supplemental bound volume, you're going to need to add sup to your date parenthetical, as you can see here. Reading this citation, I would know as the reader, hey, I have to look into the supplement or the pocket part in order to find the current version of Section 8 of Title 4 of the United States Code. Sometimes material is going to come from both the main volume and the supplement. When that's the case, you're going to indicate both in that date parenthetical. So in this example here, you find that West 2005 and Sup 2010 tells your reader to look in both the main volume and the supplement to that main volume in order to find all of the relevant information that you're citing to. Like cases, statutes also have short form citation. In order to help you find your short form citation, you're going to want to take a look at the table in Rule 12.10, printed here on the right. You can see here that the rules for having a short form citation for a statute are a lot more, well, flexible than the short forms you have for cases. So you're going to have to use your best judgment and your discretion in determining how much information you need to provide to your reader in your short form. Remember, cites are there to help the reader and to make the reader's job easier in finding the information that you're relying on. So try to pick a form that is going to be most helpful to your reader, while also not distracting the reader with a lot of superfluous information. So let's talk about some of the possible short forms you might have. Assume your long form citation is to 18 U.S.C. Section 3, published in 2012. Possible short forms are going to be listed up here in the very top of T12. Note that there's a full citation example given, a textual citation given, and a short citation. They have the named statutes listed above U.S. Code provisions. Again, you're more likely to be using U.S. Code provisions than named statutes, but be aware that there are some subtle differences between them. Your short forms for 18 U.S.C. Section 3, published in 2012, might include id. Id is a perfectly acceptable way of citing to a statute when your prior citation was to the same exact statute and provision. You could also have id section 4. So in this example, maybe I'm still citing to Title 18, whatever that covers, and whatever these sections within Title 18 cover. But now I want to call my reader's attention to Section 4. Well, since the 18, the USC, and the 2012 are all going to stay the same, the only new information I need to provide is Section 4. Now this id form would mean that I would have to have cited to Section 3 in the immediately preceding cite in order to use this format. Note also that unlike a case cite, where you would put at between id and the specific page number, in a short form citation for a statute, it's simply id space section space 4. If an id form is not appropriate, I can also just cite to that section. I might also add my title and code provision and code abbreviation if I think my reader needs that information to refresh them on which section 4 I was talking about. So note here also that the id form, the id section 4, is actually longer than the section 4 short form. And this is what I mean by you're going to need to use your own judgment and figure out which form provides the right information for your reader without distracting the reader. Here, I would probably pick the section 4 rather than the id section 4, so long as it was pretty obvious to my reader that I was still talking about Title 18 USC. Blue Book also contains some special rules for certain statutes, such as the Internal Revenue Code and some model statutes. So when you're trying to figure out how to cite a statute, you might want to look and make sure that it isn't governed by one of the particular special rules that you can find in Rule 12. The main ones that you may encounter are the Internal Revenue Code, which is governed by Rule 12.9.1. Rules of evidence and procedure likewise have their own special format under the Blue Book, and you can find it in Rule 12.9.3. Model codes, restatements, sentencing guidelines, and uniform acts can be found in Rule 12.9.4. And finally, the ABA Code of Professional Responsibility has its own rule, Rule 12.9.5. So if you're going to be citing to any of these special statutes or portions of the statutes, please make sure that you consult with the specific rules under 12.9. Let's move on to citing state statutes now. In citing to state statutes, you're going to have to remember that this is going to be very jurisdiction specific. There is no uniformity in the way states organize their statutory codes. So your first visit in trying to decode what to put into your cite to a state statute will be Table T1. If you look in Table T1, below where you found your information for your reporters, for different court names, etc., you're going to find information about each state's statutory scheme. So Table T1 still remains your best friend. In general, components of state statutes are going to include things like the title, the code abbreviation, maybe a subject abbreviation, section information, and a date and publisher parenthetical. So in many respects, it has a lot of the same basic components as a federal statute, though their format are going to vary widely from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Let's take a look at a couple examples. New York has a subject code. I know this because in Table T1 under New York, I find statutory compilations. It tells me to cite to one of the following sources if they're in. McKinney's Consolidated Laws of New York Annotated is the preferred code. Now note that that's an annotated code and it's published by West, yet it's going to be the preferred code to cite under the Blue Book. You'll see that to the right of the name of the statutory compilation, you get a basic idea of how to cite to that statute. So it's New York, insert the subject plus law, space, section, space, and then you see in the right, X. What does X mean? X X means that's where you're going to put the number of the section, plus the publisher, McKinney, plus the year. Now notice you have lots of words that are in sideways carets. You're going to find this throughout Table T1 when looking at statutory compilation sections. When you're doing your cites, do not include those carets, but instead insert the information that they're asking you to put in. It's hard to see in this print, but those carets are actually blue, which should give you an idea that that's not something you'd print in the cite. Using the information that I find in my code, I know I need to include a subject. So if I wanted to cite to section 190.05, I'd also have to include that that was the banking code. And you can find the abbreviations for each of the subjects always listed beneath the statutory compilations of any state that organizes its statute by subject. There's another thing I want you to note here. In the Blue Book, you see large and small caps used for subject and law, and then all of the abbreviations for the specific subjects likewise have large and small caps. But the example I've given you on the left is put in ordinary type. Under this new edition of the Blue Book, you have the choice to either use ordinary type or large and small caps. Whatever you choose, just be consistent and make sure that it looks good. Another example could be Illinois. Illinois is not a subject code. Instead, we organize by chapter, act, and section number. The X in my example is where I'm going to insert my chapter number. Note that I write out ill, comp, stat completely. Now, when you're reading case prints from Illinois, you're going to notice that most courts abbreviate the Illinois statutes as ILCS. And in fact, when we're writing to an Illinois court, that's the format we're going to use. But in an ordinary memoranda, where you're supposed to be following Blue Book rules, we need to follow the Blue Book's abbreviations. So here, make sure you're using ill, comp, stat. To fill in all these blanks, this is a cite for a provision of the Juvenile Court Act. It appears in Chapter 705, the Illinois Compiled Statutes. Act number 405 is the Juvenile Court Act, and I want to draw my reader's attention specifically to Section 2-18. I finish off my cite with the 2008. Now, whether you're citing to a federal or a state statute, you want to make sure that you're citing specific subsections or section spans. We want to be as specific as possible so that it's easy for our reader to find the information that we want them to see and that we're relying on for our provisions. Follow the jurisdiction's conventions for adding on those subsections, though. In Illinois, we add subsections just by putting letters and numbers in parens. It'll be pretty clearly marked within the statute itself. Sometimes you want to cite scattered sections. Where that's the case, you're going to put the scattered sections after the initial section, separating them with a comma and a space. So according to this citation, I want to draw my reader's attention to sections 2-18, 2-20, and 2-29. What about where I want to cite to a section span? You'll remember my very first example that I gave you from the federal code was for the Indian Child Welfare Act, and I put a dash between the first section and the very last section of that code. Well, in the state system, we're also going to use a dash, unless doing so is confusing. Now notice, in our Illinois statutes, we automatically have a dash in each of our section numbers. So using a dash would be pretty confusing. So instead of using a dash, I'm just going to put in the word to. In New York, on the other hand, they don't have any internal dashes already built into their cites, so I can simply put in a dash to indicate a span of sections without using the word to. If you recall back to the table I showed you from Rule 12.10, at the bottom of that table, you can find state code provisions for numbered and named codes, and some examples of how you would abbreviate it textually and in a short form citation. So let's assume that we're using the long form 705 ILCOMSTAT 405 2-18 again. Possible short forms after I put that long form in the first time, could include id, section 405/2-3, id section 2-3, simply section 2-3, or 705 Il Comp Stat 280/4. Now let me talk about where each of these would be used. Obviously your ids are going to be used if you've already been citing to 705 Il Comp Stat 405 and haven't changed from any other provisions and you haven't cited any new cases or new statutes since your last cite. Id section 405/2-3 would indicate that I probably changed my title, but I hadn't changed my chapter. Id section 2-3 says, well, I've cited a different section from the Juvenile Court Act, but I'm bringing my reader's attention back to this particular provision of the Juvenile Court Act. Section 2-3 alone would be appropriate where I haven't cited to any other titles or any other chapters within my paper. If everything is coming from the Juvenile Court Act, then section 2-3 is going to give my reader enough information to find what he is looking for. My final example here would be useful in what you would use where you're drawing your reader's attention to a different title within Chapter 705. You might do this occasionally within family law, especially because all the family law provisions and all the different statutes within the family law are codified in that Chapter 705 and one other. So you might be jumping around a bit there. Note that this is a short form because it doesn't include the date parenthetical, but that's the only thing that's cut out here, so it's not exactly the shortest of forms. Like I said earlier, you're going to need to use your best judgment and use local rules and local practice as your best guide. This is the end of your introduction to statutory citation. If you have any other questions, please see me or your TA.